So today we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves to respiratory system. So the respiratory system is pretty much more straightforward than circulatory. Because circulatory system we had to learn a lot of blood stuff that we never really actually know. But breathing we do it every single day. Well, I mean heart pumps every single day, but like we don't learn too much. So we know breathing. We know generally how breathing works. So like circulatory system, our main thing is the lung, and our kind of the transport that we're using is air. So let's go ahead and get into the diagrams. So this diagram is the diagram that I want you guys to memorize and remember, and this has everything that you're ever going to need on the test. So I'm gonna go ahead and tell you which part is which. So number one, we have the frontal sinus. This is one of the sinuses on the frontal bone of the skull. So it's what sinus is a hollow and an air-filled space. It has some sort of membrane. So it's mainly used to to make to keep your nose a little bit, a little bit wet, and it keeps it a little bit, so it has a protective layer inside of your nasal passages, so that when you breathe in and the air has some sort of, let's say, bacteria, the sinuses produces these mucus, and they're gonna eventually try their best to trap all of these irritants. So that is what the frontal sinus do. And for number two, we have the parotid sinus. This sinus is another sinus that basically produces mucus. And for number three, we have the nasal cavity. So this is where we kind of breathe. And so the nasal cavity is actually your first layer of protection. So this is where it protects your entire internal systems, and it keeps it warm, and it also filters. So 456, we don't need to know it, but it's nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So this is basically the passageway for the air to go ahead and travel into the lung. 7 is epiglottis. It is a flap that covers the air tube, also known as the trachea, so that nothing besides air enter it. So basically, when we breathe in, this thing opens up so air can travel in, and when we breathe out, this thing opens up again so it can travel. It can travel so the air can travel out. However, this is what happens like if you talk during eating. So when you're eating, you're you're chewing stuff. However, when you're talking, you're pushing air to open this flap up, open this epiglottis up. So when you're eating and then you're talking, this epiglottis opens up, so food potentially gets into your airway. So that is one thing I think parents are true about, I guess. So 8 is a larynx, otherwise known as the vocal cords. When you grow into puberty, the larynx grows and is stretched larger. So that's what causes the voice to go a little bit deeper. If you learn kind of music mechanics, you'll know how it works, which I don't. Number 9 is the esophagus. So esophagus is at the back where the food travels. So the flap that covers the epiglottis does not actually cover the esophagus. So esophagus is a food tube, so we're gonna learn that in the next kind of short period where we talk about digestive systems. And then 10 is trachea, that's where the air is, and 11 it's mainly your body. I'm not quite sure what it's talking about, so I didn't label it. So 12 is the left lungs. Right this. 13 is the right lungs. And then 14 we go into here is the right bronchus. So the bronchus is like you have trachea. The trachea it goes through the two bronchus, and the bronchus goes through these lungs, and bronchus actually goes to even smaller. Well, I guess look at these small branches. So that's 15. The small branches are called bronchioles. So these carry the air into the small sacs in your lungs. And then finally, we'll go into a zoomed in picture. So as you can see here, this is where the branch end. Like this is where it connects to these type of grape-looking like things. So these grape-looking like things, these are your alveoli. So this is where gas exchange happens. And 25, this is diaphragm, and you don't need to know this. This one is actually a cut up image of your lungs. So it's actually repeated, a little bit repeated from before. So you can go ahead and kind of tell this is a trachea and all of that. So this is a cut up image of your lungs. So now let's talk about breathing. So what is breathing? Many people know what breathing is. It's air entering your body and then air going out, right? Well, it's actually a little more complicated than that. So it's actually more towards pulmonary ventilation. So today we're gonna talk about all about breathing. So this heavily relies on pressure changes driven by different kind of muscles around in your chest, and this is how we kind of actually draw air in. So we actually have to introduce one of the laws in physics, which is pressure is proportional to 1/volume. So that's Boyle's law. So it states that increasing volume will decrease the pressure, which will draw the air in. So we'll see how that works in a second. So let's look at what happens with muscles during inhalation. So the primary muscles is the diaphragm, which is the thing, which is right here, the one under it, the one under your entire lungs. So it's gonna go ahead and flatten. So you can see this is a little bent. So it's gonna go flatten down. So that means you will have a higher volume on your entire lungs now. So now, and then we also have the external intercostal muscles, which are these muscles on top of it. You can see here they labeled it out for you. So they will lift the ribs out. So the rib cage will expand out. So basically you have more value. You have more volume. So essentially what entirely you're trying to do right now is to increase the volume. So you have a lower pressure in here. So essentially you have a higher volume and now you have a lower pressure. And then the air, they're like, oh look, this is a lower pressure space. So they want to come in so that it goes into your lungs. And then exhalation is basically different. It's opposite, I guess. It's you're trying to make you a high pressure, so you push the air out. So there's two type of exhalation. Passive exhalation is just basically you exhaling regularly. It's just the elastic recoil of the lungs and ribcage. So basically, this thing, it's actually very, very elastic. It will go bend. It will go after you push it outwards. It's gonna bend back in itself, and then the diaphragm will relax, so it goes back to this rest position. And then basically now you have a lower volume and you have a higher pressure. You're gonna push the air out of your lungs. So many times when you're experiencing coughs and stuff like that, it's because your diaphragm is not rested. And then whenever you experience potentially coughs or you know cuffs, or I guess you should call them hiccups. Yeah, sometimes. I guess sometimes hiccups too. So hiccups when you have cough or hiccups, and then you feel like, oh, my lungs, like I'm breathing, but I feel like there's an air stopping somewhere. So that's a hic. That's most of the time that's a hiccup, but sometimes it comes in a cough. So in these times, it's basically your diaphragm. It gets too tense. It gets too tense, and it's not relaxing yet. So basically, whenever you have hiccups, just hold your breath, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then breathe again. Force your diaphragm to relax, and then you're gonna be fine. And then I want to talk about something called active exhalation. This is when you're saying, you're reading, or you're exercising, so you're breathing very hard. So your internal coastal. So these muscles, they're gonna actually depress the rib. So it actually, instead of pushing it and let it go back on its own, it's gonna push it inwards. It's gonna pull it inwards. So and then the muscles is gonna push the diaphragm up. So your abs is gonna push it up, and then essentially you're gonna have a higher pressure of pushing the air out, and then you can do it faster. So the rib cage movement is basically the bucket handle motion. So rib swings outwards. There's more volume, and obviously rib has to go backwards itself. And then when rib swept upward, there's more anterior posterior volume. So whenever this thing kind of goes out, like up, you have more values down here. Whenever this thing goes out entirely, you have more general volume. That's what it's talking about. I want to talk about a little bit more about pressure changes. So inhalation, we have below atmospheric pressure. So air will be like, oh look, a lower air. So we all know air go air goes to lower pressure. So air moved to a high pressure to low pressure area. This is because, well, equalizing the pressure, it's how the world works. So when we have this below atmospheric pressure, air is going to come in. And then when we have an above atmospheric pressure, air will go out. And then that's the pressure. So your lungs, I want to talk about something. Your lungs, they always actually have a certain amount of area. So your lungs are always filled. There's a regular amount of air inside of it. So even if you're not breathing or after you're dead, you'll realize that your lungs are pumped. So that they have some air in it. They have some air that never ever goes out. And then I want to talk about a little bit of what happens when you inhale, some chemicals, or potentially you're smoking a cigarette. So the chemicals, they're gonna go in. However, the air that went in with the chemicals is gonna come out, but the chemicals is not gonna come out. So it's gonna stick onto your alveoli and stick into your lungs. And then that means that you have less alveoli to do gas exchange, and you have less lung capacity to breathe. So essentially, smoking will damage your lungs so that you cannot do hard exercises. You have less air to enter your lungs, so your entire sporting capacity is decreased. And then we want to talk about what controls breathing. So breathing is controlled by, well, central chemoreceptors, otherwise known as medulla. So a part of in your brain. It's a part in your brain. So we want to know how does it work. So instead of actually detecting oxygen level, the body is very smart. It's detecting carbon dioxide level. So whenever you realize, hey, look, there's so much carbon dioxide in my body. So the brain is gonna be like, okay, what do we do? So it's gonna send in some, water, and then it's gonna combine with the carbon dioxide ions, which is gonna be like, uh, wait, no. What am I talking about? So it's gonna send in H plus ions, and it's gonna stimulate breathing, so it takes the carbon dioxide out. Or we have these. So peripheral chemoreceptors, also known as the carotid and aortic bodies. So these things, they detect changes in blood oxygen. So these are actually detecting oxygen, and they also detect carbon dioxide and pH level. So these three things are like, well, two things. These are like the main thing that kind of trigger the reflexes to regulate blood pressure and breathing. And that is pretty much it. I want to talk about one last thing is respiration. So you might heard there's internal and external respiration. So internal respiration is actually changing oxygen from your blood and cells. So they're delivered by the red blood cells. So and then internal respiration essentially leads to cellular respiration, which happens at mitochondria and the cytoplasm. And this is going to produce a CO2. Remember, respiration is always going to give us CO2. And then essentially the external respiration happens again at the alveoli, which carries the CO2 out of the lungs. This is what I wanted to talk about. So in the lungs we have water, H2O, and then it combines with the CO2 that we carry. This is gonna give us H2CO3, which is an acid. This acid in AQ, which is dissolved in water, is gonna give H plus ions, which build up acidity. So the brain detects this acidity, and it demands a breathe out and be like, we can't have this much acid in here. So after you breathe out, essentially, you get rid of the acid. And one more thing is that I want to talk about carbon monoxide. So usually when you're breathing, you're always breathing in oxygen, which is O2 gas. And if you know a little bit of chemistry, we have O2 having a double bond. And then when you have a CO, which is carbon monoxide, you have a C double bonded to a O, which molecularly looks almost exactly like an oxygen bond. So that's why. And then basically when you breathe in, your hemoglobins, which is your red blood cells, they don't recognize, hey, look, this is not a carbon monoxide. This looks like an oxygen. Even letter-wise, it looks like an oxygen, even though that's not real. So they're like, hey, I'm gonna carry all of this carbon monoxide in my lungs, but then I realize I can't breathe it. So that's why essentially humans we're gonna die from carbon monoxide. Okay. So next class we're gonna talk about a little bit more into hiccups and why you yawn and all of that. And then after that we're gonna do the diseases of the system and also a gizmo because I like gizmos. And that is pretty much it for this class.